H.G. Wells's The Time Machine is an odd book to have become such a classic. So much of what we as a society value in popular stories is absent from this one. The protagonist is nameless and practically without any motive beyond sheer curiosity. The setting is so alien it bears almost no cultural touchstone. The social commentary, if even intended, is clumsy and toothless. Wells himself found this early work of his to be rather undergraduate, and there's little in this novella I would say is quotable or iconic, save of course the title. And yet, it persists. The creativity and readability makes it easy to pick up, easy to blaze through, and easy to move beyond. There's just enough to make it interesting for its length without having so much you feel like the story is not yet fully told. Its succinctness makes it very accessible as a novella, but were one to adapt it into a more traditional five-arc story, like for a film, you'd need to drastically alter elements. As people have tried to adapt it several times, we know this to be true. In particular, two films made just over 40 years apart from each other managed to adapt to add not only a more concrete plot, but also characterization, themes, and morals to an ultimately simplistic tale. In 1960, George Pal made The Time Machine, starring Rod Taylor, Alan Young, and Yvette Mimieux. In 2002, Simon Wells made The Time Machine, starring Samantha Mumba, Orlando Jones, and Guy Pearce. Yes, I suppose I can't avoid talking about him in the holiday season. What I find so interesting is when and where these films diverge from the novella, and where the two films differ from each other, and what I think that says about the world in which they were made, and how they're going to be remembered. One thing that is unsurprising is both films give the time traveler a name and a more developed personality. Rod Taylor's character is named H. George Wells, though other than the name is hardly inspired by him, or at the very least not his turn-of-the-century self, which is when this movie takes place. Taylor's Wells is a pacifist and a humanitarian, traits that the real Wells would embrace more in the future, but did not in 1900. Wells would also become a staunch egalitarian shortly after, in part due to conversing with Booker T. Washington. And I want to be clear, it's great that he improved himself so much. But at the time of writing The Time Machine, he held some very xenophobic views about people of color, Jewish people, immigrants, and white people of various ethnicities that weren't English. We don't really get a scene where Taylor's George puts forth egalitarian views or anything, but he speaks to all of the people he meets in the same respectful way, and he's never exhibiting microaggressions to his Scottish best friend or his French Mexican girlfriend. It's also worth mentioning that this George is, as Taylor is, Australian, not English, and there isn't really that sort of English superiority that was exhibited in some of H.G. Wells' earliest writings. Pearce's time traveler isn't English either, nor Australian as Guy Pearce is, as we are treated to his turn-of-the-century US-American accent. This is an odd choice, to me at least, to set the story in 1899 New York. Half of the actors are English, and the rest are Irish or Australian, save Orlando Jones. Don't get me wrong, he's a great addition to the cast, but to have everybody else put on fake accents instead of him, or just having people do their own accents, as it's not like turn-of-the-century New York, or London, if that's where they wanted to set it, was closed off to the rest of the world. But Pearce's character is not Wells, which I think is a strength, as it was most certainly not Wells time traveling in the novella. Pearce plays Alexander Hartigan, a professor and inventor. Both of these men are much more applied in their science than Wells, as, to my knowledge, the real Wells never made a time machine. Their characters are very similar. They are both much more driven and active than the novella's protagonist, and that's largely due to them having an actual reason to time travel. While Wells's protagonist is catapulted forwards by scientific curiosity, the other two have much more human, realistic drives. George's reason for time traveling is he tires of the perpetual warfare of the 19th century and hopes that the future will include less conflict. This is actually introduced rather organically and quite cleverly as he tries to show off his time machine, first posturing as merely curious, like in the book, only for some of his inventor friends to tell him he'd be better suited putting his genius towards something practical, like an invention for the Boer War. While he doesn't make a big deal of it to them at the time, we see it slowly revealed how much the war the world is in increases its depression and anxiety, and he confides in his closest friend Philby, who is played brilliantly by Alan Young of Scrooge McDuck fame. I also picked up on some likely unintentional gay subtext, as the two are incredibly close and affectionate, but of course nothing's explicit. Philby wants George to just be happy and accepting of his life in the present, even though he knows that's unlikely, and he's not shown any interest in getting married or having a kid like he has. Again, I bet it's just a coincidence, but thought it was worth mentioning at least. But no, George sees the future as the one place he could possibly escape perpetual war, and his fear and pain are much more relatable and universal than just messing with the laws of reality out of seemingly boredom. This also seems better, to me at least, than how 2002 handled the character's motivation. Alexander is motivated by another really human drive, but something very different. It's his desire to change an event in the past. I think that's a very strong reasoning, but the distaste comes from what he is trying to change specifically. See, Alexander is introduced as a man in love with a woman, Emma, to whom he proposes. That same night, she is murdered by a random mugger that tries to take her ring after Alexander puts up a fight. Alexander becomes despondent and resolves to change the past by traveling into it. Again, it's not that this is in any way an unbelievable motive, nor am I saying that if you had the ability to time travel, it would be immoral to try to save somebody's life. Of course not. It's just that using the death of a woman whose only pertinence to the story is her relationship with this man to motivate him to action. I likely don't need to say this, but in case you haven't heard of it, this trope is called women in refrigerators, and it's a lazy and often misogynistic way to excuse any actions you want your male protagonist to take. It's not really a natural thing to build a time machine and then time travel, but if you say, oh, well, it's just what something does after their fiance got murdered, then you're kind of just saying, hey, let's throw in a dead woman to explain any action that we want this character to take. After the machines are built, though, the stories actually line up pretty closely across all three iterations. Both the text and the films alike include interesting descriptions or depictions of what the time machine looks like and how it looks inside of a time-traveling time machine. Now's as good a time as any to talk about the effects teams for the films. The 1960s team included Bill Ferrari, Gene Warren, and Hua Chang. And I genuinely think, in terms of everything but the Morlocks, they did a fantastic job. The sets are phenomenal, the watercolor backgrounds are beautiful, the effects on the changing Earth hold up pretty well, and the time machine itself is iconic. Interestingly, and I didn't know this before doing research for this video, Chang, who sculpted the time machine, also sculpted the original phasers and tricorders on Star Trek, so this one man left some pretty big marks on the sci-fi genre. The 2002 film worked with ILM and Stan Winston's studio, who together have very illustrious resumes. Once again, I feel as though the Morlocks are the only real sour spot on their record. Some of the CGI is a little outdated, sure, but for the most part holds up nicely, and the sets are again phenomenal. I also don't blame the artist behind the Morlocks, as I have read that they were told to make things that would appear in the dark, which they did very well, only for those designs to show up in broad daylight, and they definitely don't look good there. So that's on the director, not on the designers. Anyways, back to the story. While the novella's traveler just wants to go forward a long ways to figure out what is in the future, the other two have specific actual goals in their mind. George thinks that maybe he'll find peace as far ahead as 1917. Yeah, that doesn't go well. He meets a younger Philby, also played by Young, who sadly informs him that his father died in the war. Now, I want to express why I feel this works and Emma's death does not, and it's for a few reasons. First of all, Philby has a character outside of his relationship with George, whereas Emma only exists in her relation to Alexander. Secondly, Philby's death is a sad consequence George experiences as a result of his time traveling, not something that motivates him to time travel further. Whether or not Philby was alive, the fact that he goes forward 17 years and finds that now almost the entire world is plunged into war is what motivates him to travel even further forwards in time. Thirdly, Philby only dies one time. Yes, Alexander does manage to travel backwards in time and save Emma's life, only for her to then be killed by the slowest automobile imaginable. This almost feels comical in how much this universe seemingly wants this woman to die. The amount of man pain in this film could power a small household for a week. Anyways, after the one single time he tries to save the supposed love of his life's life doesn't work, he gives up completely on that and decides he needs to travel to the future to see why it exactly is he cannot change the past. And thus George travels to 1940 and Alexander travels to 2030, where he meets 2002's The Time Machine's greatest character, Vox 114. Orlando Jones plays the hologram information desk at the New York Public Library. Vox is fantastic, enthusiastic about teaching and helping people learn, but very contemptuous when people waste his time. There are elements of other hologram characters that you've probably seen before, like the Doctor from Star Trek or Arnold Rimmer from Black Dwarf, that definitely feel like inspirations, but the overall characterization feels perfect for a librarian that literally knows everything there is to know within the library. However, when Alexander finds human knowledge hasn't managed to solve changing the past by 2030, and George finds human diplomacy hasn't put an end to wars by 1940, they go forward, with George having much more motive given he landed in the Blitzkrieg. Both actually hit a similar problem, as they are brought out of their travel by the start of the apocalypse. Yes, in both films, the state seen in the far future is not, as Wells described, the result of Darwinian evolution over time, but as a direct response to an anthropogenic cause. On the one hand, I find this much more interesting emotionally, as I think it adds a personal touch to the future that the original lacked. However, from a logical standpoint, the story gets a bit absurd, as I'll get to later. Now, the apocalypse George faces is perfect for both the theme and the time the movie released. Upon reaching 1960, sirens begin to blare, and that's what causes George to step out of the time machine. George walks to find the young Philby, now an old man, who informs him that war has come to a culmination and nuclear weapons are coming. In terror, he rushes underground and urges George to join him, but George enters the time machine instead. This time he goes forward, his machine is buried underneath magma, which solidifies into a mountain, and it takes over 800,000 years for this mountain to erode. The fear felt by George facing perpetual war is perfectly realized under the threat of nuclear warfare, and this movie invokes the fears of its 60s audiences by incorporating then very real, if ultimately unfulfilled, terror. 2002, on the other hand, has a corporation attempting to colonize the moon accidentally blow it up, sending moon rocks careening towards Earth. And while I'm always happy to see a criticism of corporate environmental destruction, this apocalypse does not tie into the themes or to Alexander's personal arc throughout the film. It's possible there was going to be a lot more, but this film released in early 2002. Even though the filming was completed a few months before 9/11, it probably was wise to cut a lot of this part out of the movie. The US wasn't really in the mood to see famous New York buildings destroyed by large flying objects, so I understand the choice to self-censor here. Anyways, Alexander gets knocked out by falling debris and only awakens in time to stop his machine, again around 800,000 years in the future, which is where we finally get to for what the story is most known. If you've never read it, the majority of the time machine takes place in the very far future and centers around two groups of humans, or species descended from humans, called the Eloi and the Morlocks. Wells describes the Eloi as small and childlike, mostly resembling humans but not behaving like them. They are apathetic, do no work, and eat fruit left out for them by the Morlocks, though they don't know this. They are pacifistic but not humanitarian, and would not lift a finger to save another from death due to a lack of interest. The traveler is able to live alongside the Eloi as he slowly learns their language, but they are unhelpful. In terms of behavior, the 1960 version copies this perfectly, which matches the theme of pacifism being admirable, but only if combined with empathy. Now, one thing both films does that I think lessens the story, but is probably necessary to save time, is eliminate the language difference. Both versions of the Eloi speak modern English, and in both cases it's explained as being due to remnant technology. But it's a bit absurd that any language would survive nearly a million years, and this contributes to the main problem of having everything in the far future be very linked to the past. I think that that is a great idea for a story. The problem is, by going 800,000 years into the future, you make it unbelievable that there is going to be anything that our main characters have experienced that is going to have a profound impact on something this far into the future. That's something that the novella doesn't really have to worry about, as the time traveler never encounters things that are because of anything that he had witnessed before. Now, both versions of the Eloi speaking English does allow for greater conversations, including one of my favorite moments in the 1960 film where George tries to understand what the Eloi do with their blissful experience. The film never tries to say that war is needed to invigorate souls, and I'm glad it doesn't, because that would be rather horrible and distasteful. Rather, it shows that the drive to care for one another and be cared for in return fosters invention and innovation, which the Eloi lack, and thus they exist with no art, science, or even true culture. The 2002 version converts the Eloi from passive and cultureless to actually rather active and intelligent. These Eloi are fantastic architects and skilled farmers. They feed and clothe themselves and practice medicine and art. Some of the Eloi speak fluent English, others only a little, in part due to Vox, who gets even better scenes as the traumatized remnant of a long-dead society, as well as a man plagued by the fact that his implied boyfriend couldn't live forever alongside him. Still, back to the Eloi. By all means, this culture is separate from the book version, and in many ways, much more likable. However, this likability also makes what happens to them seem a little infantilizing. So the Morlocks in all three versions are the other species descended from humanity, and they are subterranean, only coming above ground at night, or at least that's what it should be. They feed and clothe the Morlocks in the novella and the 1960 film, but in return kill and eat them. Essentially, they treat the Eloi as humans treat domestic cattle, or at least that which is consumed as meat. There's some ridiculous lines in the book where the narrator supposes the Eloi evolved from upper-class people and the Morlocks evolved from the working class, given the Eloi only survive off of the Morlocks' labor, but I think likening the working class to a parasitic cannibalistic species feels a little out of touch. Wells was a socialist, I know, so I'm sure nothing was meant by it, but it's just a weird idea to include, in my opinion. Thankfully, both the films instead just frame it as the difference between those who survived the apocalypse above ground and those who survived it below ground. The book and both the films do a decent job building up the mystery of who it is the Eloi fear, though in terms of who is actually the scariest, the award certainly goes to the novella. The descriptions of the Morlocks in that are genuinely haunting, whereas the physical signs of the Morlocks in the two movies, when they are in shadows, is adequate, but when they are in the light, is absurd. Now, while humans being killed and eaten like livestock is certainly upsetting, Wells was telling a Darwinian short story. The time traveler is not interested in saving the Eloi. It's not that he doesn't care, but that's not really his business, any more than it's his business if another animal eats another animal. And he only wishes to return home, though he needs his time machine, which in all versions has been stolen by the Morlocks. So he has to go rescue the time machine. Both George and Alexander, on the other hand, are proactive and more humanitarian and wish to help the Eloi and defeat the Morlocks. And here's where I suppose I should bring up the main Eloi, Wina. Wina in the novella is an Eloi that the traveler saves from drowning. As a result, she's very affectionate towards him and follows him on his quest to retrieve the time machine, only to die in the process. Now, 1960 knows that you don't introduce a character to fridge her, right, 2002? So they instead make her a damsel in distress twice over. George saves her, though admittedly many others, from the Morlocks at the end of the film. In fact, he saves their whole society. This completely changes the tone of the novella from one of dystopia unavoidable to dystopia you can change if you really try hard enough. I wouldn't say it's necessarily worse, I'd just say it's very different. Now, 2002 changes Weena's name, likely for marketability, to Mara. Mara, like the rest of the Eloi, got a huge competence bump, so Alexander doesn't save her from drowning. Rather, she saves him from his head trauma. Now, it's the fact that all of the 2002 Eloi are far more competent at survival than him that makes it seem unrealistic that he needs to be their savior. But he is also the one that frees them from Morlock tyranny. Now, they do justify this a little bit, or at least attempt to, by saying it is his technological know-how that allows him to defeat the Morlocks, but that amounts to him basically kicking his time machine until it explodes. That's an exaggeration, but he's basically just dropping a bomb on them. Plus, he rescues Mara's after she's abducted, just like 1960s Weena, while all the other Eloi, though physically fit and capable in this version, don't have the fighting spirit somehow. This character, much more than the other one, really fits in with the trend that we see in a lot of modern movies where they know that it's not right to say, hey, this outsider is way better at everything than the insiders, but they still want to have the outsider show how much more competent they are in freeing the insiders. I'll also bring up the fact that we do have a white guy coming in and playing savior to a community of people of color in this version, and make of that what you will. But while discussing the saviorism added by the movies, I should also discuss the romance added. No, not just opening kill romance, but the romance added between the traveler and the one named Eloi. See, it's weird to me that a character who is repeatedly described in the novella as childlike, and being from a people group constantly compared to children, ends up being placed in a romantic role with an adult man in the films. That isn't to say the films are placing a child with an adult, although actually now that I say that, they did both cast teenagers to play love interests to men in their late 20s or mid 30s. Sexist and ageist creepy Hollywood casting trends aside, Weena and Mara are not childlike, nor are they sexualized. As far as Hollywood romances go, it's pretty standard fare. Mara especially gets to have a little development outside of Alexander as the caretaker of her little brother and the main linguist within her tribe. It's just weird that heteronormativity is so strong in this culture that a story where a man describes somebody acting like a child translates to a straight romance, even when the script is written by a gay man. And I think this is another place where the novel definitely does better than the films. Don't get me wrong, you could easily make Weena or Mara a very compelling character, and even, potentially, have some romance in here. But when you combine this romance with the fact that she's a damsel in distress, and the fact that this character is the outsider savior to the Eloi, everything starts to add up to be a little bit distasteful. Anyways, the futility of humanity is front and center for Wells, but an obstacle to be overcome in the films. And that's fine, but that's the main difference between the novella and the two movies. In that way, what was once pessimistic became optimistic, and probably depending on your mood and what you need at the moment in your life, one would be better for your enjoyment at a different time. If you're looking for a scary or thrilling experience, the novella is the best way to experience this story. If you want something soulful and genuine, I'd recommend the 1960 version, and if you would like to watch something creative and ambitious, the 2002 version may be right for you. I think it's fascinating, though, to see other people's takes on the same story, and it's one of the oldest human traditions to add elements to a tale to fit with your worldview. I'd love to see what the 2042 version of the Time Machine looks like, and I hope that the public domain will continue to grow in size, despite some corporations' best efforts to limit it. Well, everybody, thank you for listening to me this year. Hopefully you've had a good time, and I look forward to hearing from some of you again in the future. Goodbye, everybody.